Hello everybody, welcome back to another side projects video. This one almost could have made it to the Mega Projects channel. Maybe people in the comments will be like, Simon, this belongs on the Mega Projects channel. What is it doing here? I am outraged. This is all about the raising of Chicago. This is side projects. Let's get into it. Walking along the splendid streets of downtown Chicago, surrounded by towering skyscrapers on all sides, you probably wouldn't guess that about 165 years ago, the city was almost engulfed by a muddy swamp due to the lack of natural drainage. But perhaps more unbelievably than that would be the daring and innovative scheme that the builders of Chicago undertook to solve the drainage problem by raising the whole city on thousands of jackstones over a period of 2 decades. During the 1850s and 60s, the entire city of Chicago, buildings, streets, sidewalks, and all, was manually raised to allow for better drainage. The only pieces of machinery used for the project were hydraulic jacks and jack screws. The extent of elevation varied between 4 and 14 feet in different parts of the city. All the areas close to the river, however, were lifted by a maximum of 10 feet. Private property owners funded most of the work, with public funds being used to cover the remaining costs. In the middle of the 19th century, the elevation of the Chicago area was almost the same as the shoreline of Lake Michigan, the nearest body of water. As water flows downwards, it's not a revelation, this limited the scope for natural drainage. Moreover, the city had been built on what was essentially a swamp. The original builders of the city hadn't really considered how to ensure that sewage and water drained properly, and, well, as a result, it didn't. Surprise! This came to be a huge problem when, in the 1850s, Chicago grew into an industrial center and a major lake port. Every time it rained heavily, the streets turned to mud and became nearly impassable, stranding carriages, horses, and humans alike. The lakeshore marsh on which the city had been built seemed absolutely bottomless. The basements of homes and commercial establishments were flooded with rain every time. Water stood in stagnant pools all across the city, providing an excellent breeding ground for germs and pathogens. As the population of Chicago increased, these problems were only further exacerbated. Muddy streets and unpleasant living conditions were the least of the problems caused by the lack of proper drainage. The major issue was that the pools of standing water harbored pathogens which posed a serious health menace for the residents. Outbreaks of dysentery and typhoid fever blighted Chicago for over half a decade before culminating in the 1845 cholera epidemic that killed more than 6% of the city's population. Many jokes about the muddy situation made the rounds, with one popular story proclaiming that a passerby came upon a man buried up to his shoulders in the muck and asked if he could help him out. "No, thank you," the man replied. "I have a fine horse under me." It's actually pretty good. According to another one of these jokes, a wagon abandoned in one of Chicago's muddy streets bore the pithy sign, "No bottom here." However, the humor belied the serious nature of the drainage problem and the very real health hazards that it caused. Over the years, the leaders of Chicago tried many different tactics to deal with the problem. Initially, they tried grading the streets to ensure that the water would run into the Chicago River. In civil engineering, grading is the process of ensuring a specified slope for the base of a given construction project, such as a road, railway, or garden. When grading failed to solve the drainage issue, the Chicago administration tried instead to plank the streets over. However, the wooden planks meant to prevent the formation of mud rotted and warped from all of the moisture accumulating underneath them. Finally, the Chicago Board of Sewerage Commissioners was created in order to finally, and hopefully forever, deal with the problem. In 1855, the board decided that the only viable and long-term solution was to install a comprehensive sewer and stormwater system underground. The problem was that underground sewers were built to drain the water downwards, but since Chicago was barely above the water table, the storm sewer system wouldn't work the way that it was supposed to. To make room for this new sewer system and to ensure its efficacy, the city would have to be physically lifted out of the swamp into which it was gradually sinking. A Boston engineer by the name of Ellis S. Chesbrough was hired by the Chicago Board of Sewerage Commissioners to study the problem and recommend a solution. Chesbrough designed what would soon become the first comprehensive sewer system in the United States. He drafted the plans for the system and submitted them to the City Council, which was then known as the Common Council. His plan was accepted, and workers were soon being hired to install sewers under the streets of Chicago. To make enough room for the underground sewage system above the water table, the city streets had to be raised by a few feet, although the ideal level of elevation varied from place to place. However, once the streets were higher, the surrounding buildings would look as though they were half buried, with pedestrians needing to step down from the street in order to reach their front door. Moreover, while the streets would no longer be muddy and impassable, the basements of the houses and shops around them would continue to get flooded with every single downpour. The subpar, unhygienic living conditions and frequent epidemics that they caused would just continue to persist if nothing was done. This was simply unacceptable, so the Common Council decided that all buildings they had to be lifted as well. Over the next 20 years, hydraulic lifts and jack screws were used to lift various buildings into the air so that new foundation walls could be built underneath them. Houses, shops, hotels, and even entire masonry buildings were lifted in this manner. The first masonry building in Chicago was lifted in January 1858. This was a 70-foot-long, 750-ton brick structure located in the northeastern corner of Dearborn and Randolph Streets. Over 200 jack screws were used to lift it up to its new grade, which was 6 feet and 2 inches higher than the original. The entire process was completed without any damage to the building. It was the first of more than 50 similar masonry buildings to be lifted that very year. The contract for this was given to an engineer from Boston named James Brown, who entered into a partnership with the well-known Chicago-based engineer James Hollingsworth. They soon became the most well-known building-raising partnership in town. After a few years, the engineers undertaking this mammoth project figured out how to raise an entire block's worth of infrastructure at once. A city block between LaSalle, Lake, and Clark Streets, estimated to be 320 feet long and weighing 35,000 tons, was raised in its entirety over a period of just 4 days. This was a solid masonry row of offices, shops, and printeries. The buildings in this block, made from stone, brick, and wood, were mostly 4 or 5 stories high. The entire assembly was raised 4 feet, 8 inches to make room for the sewers below. No less than 6,000 jack screws operated by 600 men were placed under the block and were used to lift the buildings, street, and sidewalks all at the same time. The process was so gradual that businesses continued as usual throughout the 4 days when the block was being lifted. A consortium of 6 engineers, including George Pullman, James Brown, and James Hollingsworth, came together and pooled their resources to successfully complete this epic project. George Pullman, who would later earn fame for designing and manufacturing the Pullman sleeper railway carriages, raised the Tremont House Hotel on Lake Street in 1861. With the help of contractors Eli and Smith, the Tremont House was raised 6 feet into the air to match the upward shifting street grade of Chicago. 6 stories high and made of bricks, the hotel was luxuriously appointed and took up about an acre of space. The raising of Tremont House was so gradual and inconspicuous that some of the guests staying there at the time, including a US senator and several VIPs, had no idea that 500 men were working under covered trenches to lift the hotel building on 5,000 jack screws. One patron wrote in bafflement that the front steps leading out of the hotel and onto the street outside were becoming steeper with every passing day. Another noted that this is incredible. Another noted that the hotel windows were several feet above his head when he checked out, whereas they'd been at eye level when he first arrived. As evidenced by primary sources, at least one building in Chicago was raised with the help of hydraulic lifts. This was the Franklin House on Franklin Street, which was raised by an engineer named John C. Lane. Being part of the Lane and Stratton Partnership of San Francisco, he had access to Californian hydraulic jacks, which were already being used to raise brick buildings in and around San Francisco in the early 1850s. The hydraulic machinery was shipped from San Francisco to Chicago, as Lane and Stratton were convinced that their method of raising buildings was cheaper and more effective than those currently in use. Not every building in Chicago went through the lifting process during the mid-19th century. Some of the hastily erected wooden homesteads that no longer fit with the rapidly growing and increasingly wealthy city were instead shifted to the suburbs and the outskirts. Old houses and shops with wooden frames that no longer had a place in the city proper were put on horse-drawn rollers and carried out to the edges of the city. They were replaced with new masonry blocks constructed to be in line with the latest grade. Over time, the sight of old, fully furnished, multi-story buildings being relocated on rollers became so common that these processions were considered to be no more than routine traffic. Sometimes entire rows of such wooden frame buildings were transported to the outskirts at the same time. On a visit to Chicago in 1868, a Scotsman named David MACRAE noted that during his stay in the city, there were few days when he didn't encounter on the streets one or more houses being rolled to a new location. One day, he met as many as 9. His observations about his visit to the US were published in the Glasgow Herald and other newspapers and can now be found in the volume America Revisited and Men I've Met. During the relocation process, the wooden frame buildings, fully furnished and intact, served the functions for which they had been originally constructed. A shopkeeper could keep his shop open and sell his merchandise en route to the new location to customers who had to climb in through a moving door. A family could begin dinner at one address and end their meal at another. Small brick buildings were also sometimes relocated, although this was relatively rare. A 2.5-story brick house owned by a man named John V. Farwell was moved from Madison Street to Monroe Street with the help of jack screws. Later, many other various brick buildings were rolled to various locations across Chicago with the help of tools such as maple and beech rollers, long intermediate needles, heavy string timbers, capstans, and windlasses. Though throughout the 2 decades when the razing of Chicago took place, life in the city continued as usual. Businesses rarely had to be closed down while streets and buildings were being lifted out of the mud. Disturbances to normal life were few and far between, allowing residents to come and go, shop and work, just as they would have done on any ordinary day of their life. Moreover, the lifting process helped boost the local economy by providing work for many young men in and around the city, as each worker could only operate 10 jack screws at a time. During the initial years, the spectacle drew thousands of people to the site whenever large buildings or city blocks were being raised. Sometimes on the final day of the lifting process, the people were allowed to walk among the jack screws at the old ground level. The razing of Chicago, a plan that would seem bold and daring for most cities even today, soon became the talk of the whole nation. For the people of 19th century Chicago, the enormous undertaking both solved a persistent problem and testified to the resourcefulness and resilience of their community. Since then, many historians and academics around the world have noted the incredible speed and thoroughness with which the city solved its seemingly insurmountable drainage and sewage problem within just 2 short decades. So I really hope you found that video interesting. I particularly found this fascinating. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe. Brand new videos several times a week. And as always, thank you for watching.